Hello, my name is Elijah Bouma-Sims, and today I'll be presenting our paper titled A US-UK Usability Evaluation of Consent Management Platform Cookie Consent Interface Design on Desktop and Mobile. So if you've been on the internet recently, you've probably seen cookie consent interfaces. They're practically everywhere. They're used to meet regulatory requirements. The practice is vary widely by website, including some deceptive design patterns. And so it's important to understand how these different designs may affect user behavior or sentiment. And these designs are often implemented using consent management platforms or CMPs, which essentially offer consent as a service, lifting some of the engineering and compliance burden off of the in-service provider. So we're presenting a usability evaluation with one of the largest CMPs, OneTrust. In particular, we wanted to look at three research questions. First, do users in the US and UK perceive or interact differently with cookie consent interfaces? US and UK are both predominantly English-speaking countries. However, in the US, there's no national privacy regulation, where in the UK, they are under the data protection law, the UK GDPR. So we hypothesize that this may affect user behavior or sentiment. Second, do users on mobile devices interact with or perceive cookie consent interfaces differently? Much of the previous work on cookie consent interfaces has focused on desktop users, but it's important to understand how users on non-traditional computing devices may experience the cookie consent interfaces differently. And finally, we wanted to look at various design factors such as prominence, location of cookie definitions, and initial cookie options that may impact users' attitudes and behaviors. These have been identified by previous work, but additionally, the location of category definitions is a novel design factor, which because previous work has shown that cookie category terms such as functional cookies, strictly necessary cookies can be confusing to users, we hypothesize that including a way to view the definitions on the initial screen may improve user experience. So in order to investigate these research questions, we conducted a study with crowd workers recruited from Prolific. We recruited 1,359 users, half from the US and half from the UK. They were directed to complete a distraction task on a simulated e-commerce website. In particular, they were asked to add something to their cart. While they were doing that, they encountered a one of 14 cookie consent interface designs that were all implemented using OneTrust. After they completed the task, we sent them to a post-test survey which evaluated various usability goals. So obviously, I don't have enough time to go over all the consent interfaces. However, I wanted to highlight a few. First, this is the baseline interface, which served as the basis of comparison in statistical testing. This includes the complete options path, so you have the ability to make any consent choice from the initial screen without having to go to a secondary screen. And additionally, like all of our interfaces, includes a close button, which dismisses the banner. As I mentioned earlier, one of the design factors we are investigating was the location of definitions. So in particular, we had 4 designs that included a way to view the definitions on the initial notice. Here, you can click an accordion, sort of the plus sign here, and it will open a accordion interface with the definition in it. Finally, another one of the factors we investigated was sort of the set of initial options that are presented to the user. So here you can see a 3-button interface, what we called it, that has the ability to accept all or accept only necessary cookies on the initial screen versus a fairly common practice, which is only giving the user the ability to accept all cookies on the initial screen, and they must click a link in order to access any other choice. So now I will highlight our results. So first, one of the interesting things we found was that UK users were less likely to dismiss the banner using the X button in the corner. They were about half as likely. We hypothesized this may be because in the UK, it is an opt-in system for privacy choice, where in the US, it's generally an opt-out system. So in the US, if you include a close button and the user uses it, you can safely default to accepting all cookies, where in the UK, if you included a close button, the default would have to be accepting only necessary cookies. So in the UK, cookie banners are sort of incentivized to not include a close button. And because of that, we hypothesized that UK users may be less used to the close button and therefore less habituated to using it. Another finding with regard to mobile users was that mobile users were more likely to accept all cookies. In general, the experience on mobile is worse. The banner takes up more of the screen and is more difficult to interact with on a small screen. So it may be that mobile users sort of clicked the most obvious, easy to access option just to dismiss the banner. And in many cases, that's just clicking to accept all. Another result with regards to the country of residence was that US users were generally more positive about cookie consent interfaces than UK users. So this was across many of the, more than half of the sentiment questions that we evaluated in the survey. The one we're showing here in particular, where we asked users to compare the consent interface they saw to others they may have previously seen. And as you can see, in general, US users were more likely to say the interface was much better or somewhat better than UK users. With one reason this may be is that UK users may have a more negative sentiment about cookie banners as they've been around longer in the UK. Previous work has shown that if you're in Europe or in the UK, you're more likely to encounter a cookie banner. So it may be that UK users are generally more frustrated with the cookie banners due to their longer experience. This result is with particular regard to the different designs we evaluated. What you're seeing here is a graph of the consent decision by condition in order of the percentage that accepted only necessary cookies. So the sort of pinkish purplish bars are people who accepted only necessary cookies. The green or yellow bars are people who accepted all or made a custom selection. And then the blues are people who dismissed the banner or ignored it. What I want to highlight here, and I should mention that the baseline is bold, and those that differed significantly with regards to the baseline have an asterisk next to them. So what I want to highlight is that in those conditions where the only initial option was to accept all cookies, users were generally, as you may expect, much less likely to make a decision other than accepting all cookies. So overwhelmingly in these conditions where you only had the option to accept all cookies on the initial screen, people are only accepting all cookies. So this has a strong impact on user behavior. So a few other results. One qualitative finding is that the close button is confusing to users. We asked them, one of the questions we asked was, what do you expect to happen because you click the close button? And people thought opposite things. So for example, this person thought that it meant that they do not accept all cookies, whereas this person thought that by default, the website would accept all cookies and just without letting them know. And the reality is that there's no way from this interface to know what the close button will do. And this practice can vary from website, so there's no consistency in what will happen. As I mentioned earlier, we hypothesized that the presence of definitions may help user comprehension. However, none of the interfaces with the ability to view the definitions from the initial screen improved comprehension or had any other effect on user behavior. So this does not seem to be a good way to improve user comprehension. So I wanted to close with some design recommendations based on our results. First, consent interfaces should not include a close button without indication of functionality. Along the same lines, it should be clear what happens if users ignore a non-blocking banner. So if they don't have to interact with the banner, they should know what happens if they don't interact with it. Third, cookie consent interfaces should include both cookie acceptance and rejection choices in the first cookie banner users see. So as we saw from these previous results, that can have a strong impact on user behavior if you only have an accept all option. Fourth, the industry should standardize and adopt more intuitive terms for cookie categories. If including the definition doesn't work on the initial screen, then we likely need terms that are better at communicating what each of these categories are. Fifth, developers should make consent interfaces usable on mobile devices devices. And finally, CMP defaults should promote more usable consent interfaces.